Welcome to the Pocket Recovery Show. I'm your host, Vance Hansen. Each episode, we dive into the raw, real causes of fear, anxiety, and addiction. We give you the exact biohacks needed to break the cycle, quiet the internal chaos, and regain control of your life. Thanks for hitting play. Now let's get started. Breath. Let your shoulders drop. I want you to picture something before we begin. A Tuesday evening, 5:30, maybe 6, you pull into your driveway after a day that started way before you were ready and never really stopped. There's an email you haven't answered, a meeting tomorrow you haven't prepared for, and your phone is still buzzing in your pocket. You sit in the car for a moment before you go inside because inside means more demands, more energy that you don't have, and more the feeling that there's something wrong with you for not being able to show up. And then you go in, and the first thing you do before dinner, before anyone gets your full attention, before anything else, is reach for the one thing that takes the pressure down. Maybe it's a drink, maybe it's a pill, maybe it's something you smoke, or something you've been prescribed and never questioned. Maybe it's something so normalized you haven't thought about it as a substance at all. In that moment, you're not weak. You're not broken. You're not someone who lacks discipline or doesn't care about the people waiting for you on the other side of that door. Your nervous system in a chronic survival state, reaching for the only thing that has ever reliably brought it back to baseline. And it worked. That's the truth. And it's hard to admit. It worked. Today, we're going to talk about why. Hi, I'm Vance, and I'm an alcoholic. And I'm also a licensed addiction counselor and trauma professional. Welcome to episode 4 of the Pocket Recovery Show. And today, the question is, why did you use? Stop calling what you did weakness, because here is what the neuroscience actually shows. Your nervous system was in a chronic survival state, depleted, dysregulated, and screaming for relief. And then it found something that worked, something that dropped the activation from a 7 to a 3, something that it couldn't reach on its own. This is not a moral failure beginning, that is learning. Your nervous system learned a solution. The problem was the cost to keep using it. Please get this. Understanding why you use does not give you permission to keep using or justify the things you did while using. What it does give you is the only thing in my recovery that made sense, the truth. And the truth is that your nervous system was not failing you. It was solving the problem the only way it knew how. In episode 1, we established the foundation. Chronic stress pushes the nervous system into a survival state it cannot get out of on its own. Willpower fails because it's a top-down strategy applied to a bottom-up emergency. What episode 1 did not answer, and what this episode is here to answer, is what your nervous system found when it went looking for a way out of that state. Let me give you 3 quick pictures. Try to find your story in one of them. First, the high-functioning professional who comes home after 10 hours of cortisol and amygdala activation and reaches for the one thing that reliably drops that activation level from a 7 to a 3. Not to get drunk, but to get to what normal was supposed to feel like. The next person has been in emotional shutdown for so long, flat, numb, the nothing state from episode 3. And when they used, they didn't feel high. They felt warm, safe, connected, maybe for the first time in years. And the third, this person is living in the deepest freeze. They couldn't initiate, couldn't feel, couldn't function, and they took a stimulant and discovered they could think, could start things, and could be the person they remembered before the freeze took everything. Not euphoria, function. 3 people, 3 substances, and 3 completely different experiences. One underlying truth, though. Their nervous system was in a state it could not regulate on its own, and it found the most efficient regulation available to it. That is not a moral failing beginning. That is a pharmacological event beginning. And the specific receptor-level mechanism of what the substance was actually doing inside their brain, which very few people in recovery explain clearly enough, that is the purpose of this episode. Because until you understand the mechanism, you're trying to stop a biological process with a motivational strategy. And that is a fight I kept losing. Let me show you exactly what was happening, starting with my own story. I want to start where my story starts, because I was the first archetype for years. When I was in my addiction, I was working in consulting and software development, fast paced projects, high client demands, the kind of work where the pace does not stop and the expectations do not bend. I was good at it. I showed up and I delivered. But somewhere in the accumulation of all those days, pressure, and climbing the ladder, something shifted in me. I stopped wanting to go bowling. I stopped wanting to play with my kids. I stopped wanting to work on the yard or do the other things to feel like living. By the time I got home, I had nothing left. Not emotionally, not physically, nothing. And then I found the thing that refilled the tank, or at least the thing that made me stop noticing the tank was empty. I told myself I deserved it. I worked hard. 1 or 2 drinks after work, I earned them. But looking back now, with everything I understand about the nervous system and nervous system regulation, I was not rewarding myself. I was medicating a survival system that had been running past its sustainable limit for so long it did not know how to stop. And that medication was keeping me in the survival state. The moment I knew it was no longer a choice was the first time I tried to stop. I made it a few days, then the noise came back, louder than it had been before I tried to stop drinking. I started by telling myself just 1 or 2. And within days, I was right back to where I was. I repeated that cycle many more times than I can count, each time believing that this would be different, each time finding that my intentions did not have a vote in what my biology was doing. What I didn't understand then, and what I'm going to give you right now, is the exact mechanism behind every bit of that pattern, not as a moral story, as a chemistry story. As we spoke about in episode 2, alcohol is a GABA A receptor agonist and an NMDA glutamate antagonist. What that means is your brain runs on a balance between 2 opposing chemical systems, one that accelerates activity and one that puts a brake on. Alcohol enhances the brake and suppresses the accelerator simultaneously. For a nervous system that has been floored in overdrive all day with no way to slow down, that's not intoxication, that's relief. The constant low grade amygdala firing, the threat scans, the cortisol surges, the relentless activation, it turns down. The prefrontal cortex realigns blood flow and comes back online. The body drops from a 7 to a 3 on the activation scale. For someone running at a chronic 7 or even higher, a 3 is not a buzz. A 3 is baseline, normal. A 3 is what sober is supposed to feel like. That's the most important thing I can tell you about alcohol and addiction. The goal? It was rarely to get drunk or high. No, the goal, in fact, was to get to normal. And alcohol got me faster and more reliably there than anything else my nervous system had tried. This is why I Deserve a Drink is such a durable story. The brain's not lying when it says it deserves relief. The relief is real. The problem is not the need. The problem is the method of meeting it and what it actually costs. Your brain has its own opioid system, endorphins, your body's endogenous morphine. They're produced naturally in response to pain, physical exertion, laughter, safe connection, and felt security. They bind to mu opioid receptors, and this produces pain relief, emotional warmth, and the felt sense of well being. Here's what chronic stress and unresolved trauma do to that system: they deplete it. The endorphin supply gets exhausted, the receptors become less responsive, and the nervous system that was already undersupplied with its own regulation chemicals finds itself increasingly unable to produce the warmth and safety it needs to function. External opioids flood those same receptors with a signal so powerful it overwhelms everything else. For someone in chronic physical or emotional pain and chronic nervous system dysregulation, while it is chronic emotional pain, the relief is total and immediate. But for someone in the dorsal vagal freeze state, opioids produce something even more profound than relief. They produce warmth and belonging, that felt sense of safety that their system has been starved of. This is why opioid addiction devastates trauma survivors at rates no other population experiences. It's not that they lack willpower, it's that for the first time in their lives, their body knows what safe feels like, and they will do anything to feel it again. This is also why Dr. Gabor Mate's foundational question in addiction medicine is not, Why the addiction? It is why the pain. Because the opioid was never the problem, it was the answer. The problem? The unregulated nervous system, the depleted endorphin supply, the chronic absence of felt safety. Those existed long before the first use. Now I'd like to talk about stimulants. Stimulants flood the reward circuitry with dopamine and norepinephrine. For a brain in sympathetic overdrive, this paradoxically produces focus and clarity, the norepinephrine organizing a chaotic system, the dopamine providing the motivational push that chronic stress has been suppressing. But for a brain in dorsal vagal shutdown, in the flat, numb, emotional numbness state, stimulants produce something even more significant. They turn on the lights. The lights in a house that has been dark for so long that the occupant has forgotten what electricity feels like. The clinical reality of stimulant use disorder is rarely the euphoria that popular culture depicts. For many people, it's the experience of functioning like a human being for the first time in years. They're not chasing a high, they're chasing baseline. And losing access to that baseline, returning to the empty, unreachable state of dorsal vagal shutdown, is one of the most brutal experiences in early recovery. Not because they miss the euphoria, but because they miss being able to start a task, feel a feeling, or be present with the people they love. Most people assume addiction is about chasing a high. And for some of the time, that's true. But for most of the people I work with and in my own recovery experience, it wasn't about getting high. It was about getting back to normal. Your nervous system was in a chronic survival state. The substance dropped the activation to where baseline is supposed to be. That relief isn't euphoria. That's called homeostasis. The most important distinction, and one that removes the moral failing question from the equation, you weren't chasing a high. You were chasing functional. And when you understand that, the question of why you can't just stop gets a very different answer. Finally, I'd like to talk about cannabis, benzodiazepines, and nicotine. Cannabis activates the endocannabinoid system, specifically the CB1 receptors concentrated heavily in the amygdala. Remember, this is your danger alarm. For a nervous system running constant threat assessments, cannabis can significantly reduce amygdala hyperactivity and quiet that alarm that's been firing all day. For high activation free states, this is immediate and reliable. The same mechanism also explains why heavy long-term cannabis use can paradoxically increase anxiety over time. Chronic CB1 activation leads to receptor shutdown, or downregulation as it's called, and the baseline amygdala sensitivity gradually rises to compensate. What it means is the more you use cannabis to turn the alarm down, the louder it gets when you stop. Your brain compensates for the constant quiet by making the system more sensitive. So over time, the thing that was calming your anxiety starts producing more of it. Benzodiazepines, Xanax, Valium, Klonopin, and the like, work through a nearly identical mechanism to alcohol: GABA A potentiation, glutamate suppression. This produces a rapid anxiety reduction, and in fact, many people get addicted to benzos through a legitimate prescription. A physician responding appropriately to a dysregulated nervous system. The route was clinical. The biology was identical to alcohol. The dependence formed the same way, at the same speed, and for the same biological reason. The label on the bottle said prescribed. The receptor system didn't care. Now, nicotine, the most normalized and most widely dismissed substance of all, activates the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors and produces a rapid, reliable dopamine release within seconds of inhalation. Every person who's ever said, "I smoke to manage stress," is telling the complete biological truth. Nicotine, it is a nervous system regulator. It just comes with a delivery system that destroys the body more slowly than the alternatives. Different substances, different receptor systems, different subjective experiences, same fundamental story. Your nervous system was not in a state Your nervous system was not in a state it could regulate on its own, and it found the thing that worked. You need to know this. Your nervous system found the thing that worked. Biological problem solved. not a moral failing. Here's what that means. You were not broken before you started using. You were dysregulated. And in the absence of any other tool for regulation, your nervous system did exactly what it was designed to do. It found the most efficient path back to homeostasis, back to normal. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to be understood completely, clearly, and without flinching. When people ask me why I couldn't stop at one or two drinks, I used to say I didn't know. Now I know exactly. And I know it's not a character flaw, it's receptor pharmacology. Every time you use a substance to regulate your nervous system, the receptors it targets begin to adjust. They become less sensitive. They require more to produce the same effect. The drink that used to drop you from a 7 to a 3 now only gets you to a 5. So you drink more to get to 3. And in drinking more, you push the baseline up again. Just one or two fails not because you're weak. It fails because the receptors have already moved. You're trying to hit a moving target. That's the cycle, and it's 100% biological. Here's where the story turns. Because everything I just described about why the substance worked in the first place, it's also the exact reason it stopped working. The nervous system is adaptive. This is both its greatest strength and the foundational mechanism of addiction. When a substance repeatedly activates a receptor system, the brain does what it always does. When a signal becomes chronic, it adapts. It reduces receptor sensitivity and it produces fewer of its own natural equivalents. It recalibrates the entire system around the presence of the substance. That is the biological mechanism behind every version of tolerance you've ever experienced. With alcohol, the GABA receptors become progressively less sensitive to both alcohol and your own naturally produced GABA. NDMA glutamate receptors, they simultaneously upregulate, becoming more active and more sensitive to compensate for the ongoing suppression. The result? It's a new baseline that is more anxious, more activated, and more dysregulated than the original. The nervous system that was running at a 7 before drinking is now running at a 9 when sober, because the entire system has recalibrated around the presence of the alcohol. If this sounds familiar, it should. It is the phantom brake from episode 2. But now you can see exactly what is happening at the receptor level. The sense of control that one drink provided in the beginning was always borrowed. The relief was real, but the brake was borrowed against a future the nervous system could not afford to repay. This is the exact mechanism behind what I experienced. 1 or 2 drinks became 3 or 4, 3 or 4 became the architecture of my evening. And every time I tried to step back, every time I said just 1 or 2, I found that 1 or 2 produced less relief than before because the receptors had already adjusted downward. I was trying to hit a target that had moved, not because I was weak, but because receptor pharmacology does not care about intentions. The escalation is not a choice. It's a consequence of a regulatory system trying to maintain homeostasis, balance in the presence of a substance that keeps moving the target. The dose that once dropped you from a 7 to a 3 now only gets you to a 5. So you use more. And in using more, you push the baseline up even further. The cycle accelerates on its own. Here is what I didn't understand when trying to quit, and it sent me back to drinking every single time. When you remove the substance after the system has downregulated around it, you're not returning to your original baseline. You're exposing the hyperactivated, hypersensitized state that the downregulation created. For alcohol, this means the glutamate system, which was chronically being suppressed. It rebounds dramatically. Anxiety spikes. Sleep becomes nearly impossible. The body braces itself. In severe cases, glutamate rebound can produce seizures because the excitatory system has been suppressed for so long that removing the suppression triggers a cascade. But even in moderate withdrawal, what you experience is not the absence of alcohol. It is the exposure of a nervous system that has become more dysregulated than it was before you ever started using. The original freeze returns, harder, louder, and with a new layer of shame on top of it. This is the double hijack in its most devastating form. The freeze is back. The shame of having tried and failed, it arrives immediately after. And the only thing that it has ever reliably interrupted both of them is right there, waiting. I remember what those first few days felt like every time I tried to stop. The noise I described, the one that alcohol had been quieting for years, it became deafening. And my biology was not asking me to drink for recreation. It was running an emergency protocol that it had learned over the years of training. When the noise gets loud, you know what to do. Just one or two was not a decision. It was a survival instruction from a nervous system that had learned one specific solution to one specific crisis. And the crisis was real, even though the solution was destroying me. If you are in early recovery and you feel worse than you did when you were using, I need you to hear this clearly. You're not failing. You're not weak. This is not proof that recovery is not working. When you remove a substance your nervous system has been regulating with for months or years, you're not returning to your original baseline. You're exposing a nervous system that recalibrated itself around the presence of that substance. The anxiety is higher, the freeze is worse, the noise is louder, not because sobriety made things worse, but because your receptor system is now running without its external support before it has rebuilt its internal support. This is biology, and it's temporary, but only if you understand what you're dealing with. Welcome back to the Pocket Recovery Show. I want to address something that I hear from people in early recovery more than almost anything else. It comes in different words, but it's always the same sentence underneath. I feel worse now than I did when I was using. And the response most people get is something about the process, about patience, about just getting through it. And those things are not necessarily wrong, but they're missing the biology. And without the biology, just get through it's indistinguishable from just use more or just use more willpower, which we've established neither one of those will work. Let me tell you what's actually happening in early recovery, not as a discouragement, but as a map. When you remove a substance your nervous system has been using to regulate, two things happen simultaneously. First, the regulatory function the substance was performing is now unmet. The noise returns, the freeze comes back, the warmth, the aliveness, the baseline, whatever the substance was providing is gone. And the nervous system, which learned to outsource that function, does not yet know how to perform it internally. It lost access to its own regulation toolbox. It's been running on an external solution for so long, it's forgotten the internal one exists. And then second, the receptor downregulation that chronic use produced, that means the natural systems are temporarily underperforming. Your endogenous GABA is less effective than it used to be. Your endorphins are producing less warmth and relief. Your dopamine baseline is depleted from chronic stimulation. Your endocannabinoid system is less sensitive to its own signals. Everything that was supposed to be holding you together, it's running way below capacity. The result is a nervous system in early recovery simultaneously dealing with the original dysregulation that drove the using in the first place, plus the receptor changes the using produced, and a natural regulation system that is temporarily compromised. This is the worst freeze, and it is completely, entirely, 100% biological. I need to say that again clearly. The way you feel in early recovery is not evidence that you cannot recover. It is evidence that your nervous system has been running on an external regulation system for so long that the internal one needs time, repetition, and the right inputs to come back online. It's not a verdict about who you are. It's a timeline for what your biology needs. Clinicians call this post-acute withdrawal syndrome, or PAWS. You might have heard of it. It's documented and it is real, and it is one of the most under-recognized forces driving relapse. Not because the person gave up, because they didn't know what they were dealing with. They thought the misery meant they were broken. What it actually meant was their nervous system was still in the process of healing, of rebuilding what the substance had dismantled. That process has a timeline, and knowing the name is the first step to surviving it. Now I want to talk about something called neuroplasticity. We've mentioned this in other episodes, but it's the fact that your brain can change. Dr. Donald Hebb's foundational work on neuroplasticity established that neurons, the nerve cells, that fire together, wire together. This is the same principle that built the addiction pathways. Repeated activation of that regulation through substance loops strengthened those connections until they felt like instinct. The same principle works in reverse. Every time you use a bottom up somatic tool instead of reaching for a substance, you're laying a new neural pathway. Thin at first, barely perceptible, but real. And each repetition strengthens it. The brain that built the addiction wiring can build the recovery wiring. That's not optimism. This is the documented mechanism of neuroplastic change. In episode 3, we introduced 4 somatic tools: the physiological sigh, VU breathing, the orienting response, and the butterfly hug. I told you at the time these were not just coping strategies. I want to revisit that statement now that you have the receptor level chemistry because I want you to understand exactly what these tools are doing at the biology level and why they're the right replacement for what the substance was providing. Let's start with the physiological sigh. The physiological sigh produces a rapid reduction in CO2, triggers vagal tone, and lowers heart rate through parasympathetic activation. What was alcohol providing? GABA-mediated deceleration of a nervous system running too fast. The physiological sigh begins to produce the same deceleration through breathing mechanics and vagal activation rather than receptor chemistry. Not as fast, not as dramatic in the early weeks, but just as real. And every time you use it, you're training the parasympathetic system to respond to a body-based signal instead of waiting for an external substance. You're rebuilding the brakes that alcohol was borrowing. VU breathing. It directly stimulates the vagus nerve through low-frequency vibration, activating the parasympathetic response and reducing the dorsal vagal freeze state. What were opioids providing someone in shutdown? A felt sense of safety, access to warmth and connection. VU breathing begins to produce access to that same ventral vagal state, slowly, quietly, and without cost to the receptor system. Every VU breath is a small deposit into the regulation account the opioids were draining. The orienting response, the slow visual scan, the deliberate widening of gaze, tells the brainstem the threat has passed and reduces amygdala hyperactivity through the visual vestibular system. What was cannabis providing? Reduced CB1-mediated amygdala alarm activation. The orienting response does the same thing without touching a single receptor. And unlike cannabis, repeated use produces increasing nervous system sensitivity rather than downregulation. The butterfly hug, or bilateral stimulation. It begins the reintegration of the 2 brain hemispheres that chronic stress and trauma have disconnected. What was the stimulant providing someone in shutdown? The felt sense of aliveness, the capacity to initiate, think, and be present. Bilateral stimulation begins to reopen those pathways from the inside, building the brain's own integration capacity without the dopamine depletion that follows stimulant use. Here's what people in recovery are rarely told. The somatic tools we use, the breathing, the VU sound, the room scan, the butterfly hug, they're not just stress management techniques. They're biological replacements for the function the substance was performing. The physiological side does what alcohol was doing to your GABA system, decelerating the nervous system running too fast. The VU breath does what opioids were doing for people in freeze, activating the vagus nerve and producing a felt sense of safety. The orienting response does what cannabis was doing to your amygdala, reducing the constant threat scan. Slower than a substance, harder to access under pressure, but they build something instead of borrowing from it. These tools are not as fast as a substance. The substance worked in minutes, sometimes seconds, and the tools work in weeks or months. But the substance was borrowing from a future your nervous system could not afford. The tools? They're building something the substance could never give you. A regulation system that gets stronger every time you use it. What sustainable recovery actually looks like, and what nobody explained clearly enough in my own recovery, is not the removal of the substance. It is the construction of a new regulation architecture. Because the original need was real, the freeze was real, the noise was real, the emptiness was real. None of those things disappear because the substance is gone. They were there before the first use, and they'll be there after the last one. The question is what you build between them and what you do for your nervous system. Every tool is a regulation alternative. Every conscious breath is a regulation alternative. Every safe co-regulating relationship, every connection with another nervous system that is regulated and present, it's a regulation alternative. Every moment you orient your environment instead of bracing against it is a regulation alternative. Recovery is not the suppression of the need. Recovery is the construction of a biological infrastructure capable of meeting it without destroying you in the process. Here's what I want you to carry with you. The craving is a symptom. It is not a character flaw. Your nervous system remembers the solution that worked, and when the problem presents itself again, when the stress climbs, when the noise returns, when the freeze hits, the memory fires and the symptom of craving happens, not as a thought, as a biological instruction. Recovery is not the suppression of that symptom. It is the construction of actual solutions for the problem. A dysregulated nervous system. One breath at a time, one tool at a time, one small regulation at a time, until the new pathway is thick enough to compete with the old one. That takes time, but it is happening every single time you choose tool over the substance. And when the tool only helps 5%, when the urge still wins, that pathway is built. The nervous system is learning. You are not fighting your biology this time. You're teaching it something new. Welcome back to the final stretch of the Pocket Recovery Show. I'm Vance Hansen. Let me acknowledge where we have been today before I hand you your assignment. We connected 3 quick pictures in the foundation you built in episodes 1 through 3, and then we went somewhere new. We went into the receptor level. We looked at the chemistry of every major substance class and found the same story in every mechanism. A nervous system in dysregulation finding the most efficient regulation available to it. We looked at why it stopped working. The downregulation, the tolerance, the withdrawal freeze that made stopping feel more dangerous than continuing. And we established the tools from episode 3 are the biological replacement for the function the substance was performing. Before I give you your assignment, one honest thing about where you are in recovery right now. If you're in early recovery, if you're in the first hours, days, weeks, or months of removing the substance, the way you feel is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of healing your biology. Your nervous system is recalibrating what was organized around the use of an external substance to regulate itself. That takes time, measured in months, not days. But the direction is everything. Not perfection, direction. Recovery is slower than the addiction. The substance worked in minutes. The biology of rebuilding, it takes months. That's not bad news. That's honest news. Because the alternative, expecting to feel better in a week and feeling broken when you don't, is the exact same trap that sends people back. Your nervous system did not get dysregulated overnight. It will not recalibrate overnight. But here is what is true. Every somatic tool you use is building a new neural pathway. Thin at first, but real. 5% is better. 45 minutes of relief instead of 3 hours of craving is real progress. Don't measure it in days. Measure it in direction. Here is your assignment for this week. One task. No transformation required. Your assignment? Identify the reach. This week, I want you to identify one moment, just one, when your body reached for regulation. Not necessarily towards the substance. It might be the substance, but it might also be food, scrolling, overworking, withdrawing, rage, or control. Any behavior your nervous system has learned to use as a circuit breaker for an overwhelming internal state. One moment. Notice it as it is happening, or just after. And before you do anything else with it, before you judge it, analyze it, or shame it, I want you to name what it was reaching for. Not what it reached toward, what it was reaching for. Was it quiet? Was it warmth? Was it the ability to start something? Was it the absence of a feeling that had become intolerable? Just name it. One word if that's all you have. Write it down if you can. You're not solving it this week. You're identifying the need underneath the behavior, because you cannot build a regulation replacement for something you cannot name. That is the whole assignment. One moment, one need named. If you want to go further, if you want to run the physiological sign in that moment and notice whether it moves the needle at all, do it. 2 double inhales, 1 long exhale. Notice what happens to the need on the other side. Not whether it disappears, whether it shifts. 5% is information, and information is how recovery is built. I want to close this episode with something I've been building toward since episode 1. The reason you used was not that you were broken, weak, or a bad person. The reason you used was that your nervous system was in pain without the tools to address that pain. So, you found something that worked. It cost you things you cannot get back. I know that. I've lived inside that cost. But the architecture underneath, the freeze, the dysregulation, the desperate need for the noise to stop, that was never your fault. And understanding that is the foundation for building something that actually holds. Episode 5 is where we go next, and I want to plant something for you to hold. Understanding why you use changes what you owe yourself in recovery. But there is one force, one specific force that sits between that understanding and actually being able to use it. That force sends people back to use just like any other trigger, any craving, or any difficult day. That force has a name, and it is the subject of our next episode. Thank you for being here on the Pocket Recovery Show. I'm Vance Hansen. Breathe slow, stay grounded, and I'll see you right back here next time. That wraps up today's episode of the Pocket Recovery Show. Remember, change doesn't happen in giant, heroic leaps. It happens in the tiny, invisible spaces between a trigger and a reaction. Every time you choose a deep exhale or a somatic reset instead of running for an escape hatch, you are rewriting your nervous system. If these strategies brought you some clarity or relief today, please hit subscribe, leave an honest review, and share this episode with just one person in your life who always seems to be running on empty. Let them know they aren't broken either. For real-time support and the daily tools we talked about today, head over to pocketrecovery.app. Your scaffolding is waiting for you there. Until next time, keep your feet on the floor, listen to your system, and be remarkably gentle with your biology. We'll talk soon.